Hello everyone, my name is Tremaine Kaleb, and it is my privilege as the Chair of Solidarity Cabinet to welcome you all to our 7th event of the year, Exploring Whiteness. I will be giving the introduction for our time here, and then the events co-coordinator, Sarai Lopez, will guide us into the next part of our program. So for those who don't already know, the students serving on Solidarity Cabinet this year are Hannah Geringer and Sarai Lopez, our events coordinators. John-Mark Daniel and Miriam Bigash, as our PR managers. Nadia Brothers, our administrator. And our newest position held by Nicole Blaskowitz, our chaplain. We look forward to serving you all for the rest of the semester this year, and we hope to serve you well. So on behalf of Solidarity Cabinet, I'd like to extend our many thanks to all the students, staff, and faculty who contributed to this event. The 7 members of Solidarity are wearing red shirts. Will be scattered throughout the room after the event, and we welcome you to approach us with any questions, comments, or concerns that you like. And before we get started with the program, though, I will be sharing some background information about Solidarity Cabinet and end the devotional sent to our event tonight. So Solidarity Cabinet is a 16-year-old organization, student organization, and at its heart is our mission of racial conciliation. We believe by approaching topics in race with a posture of self-awareness and grace for others and ourselves, we can navigate systemic and internal issues despite our human tendencies to be problematic at one point or another in our thoughts, speech, and actions. So we are centering our programming around establishing and exploring our personal racial identities as a student body in order to more lovingly and honestly interact with one another and race and outside of the church. And while we plan to target specific audiences, like today's is the white student body, throughout the year, we welcome all members of the Wheaton College community to all our events and programming. And we invite you all to walk alongside us and get comfortable and heavy kingdom work of racial conciliation. So our mission as a cabinet is Solidarity Cabinet exists to foster a learning community that explores issues of race, culture, and diversity, both within our community and society worldwide, and to build up student reconcilers on the Wheaton College campus who seek to live out the gospel message of reconciliation. And our vision is Solidarity Cabinet seeks to embrace humility and exhibit Christ's hospitality by actively seeking the truth and love with others. And as you may have seen last week, our question of the month is, how do you think issues of race have progressed this past year? While there were a wide range of responses, they all pointed to the fact that for many of our students, there is a hesitancy or resistance to dedicating a significant amount of time in racial identity development. However, I believe God designed us intentionally, and that racial diversity is neither a curse nor a burden. At least God did not design it to be so. Now, in the face of deep wounds and scars of racial prejudice, how can one hope to understand another racial experience if one does not try to understand their own racial experience themselves? And since we live in a fallen world, we as a cabinet seek to foster racial conciliation at a predominantly white institute, or PWI for short. And we believe that the 77% white majority of our undergraduate student body should be offered a space to explore and hopefully reconcile their whiteness and all its complexity. This event is a 2-part series, with the first part discussing white racial identity and privilege, and the second part focusing on the idea of being a white ally. The goal of this event is to encourage white students at Wheaton College to seek a deeper understanding of their racial identity and privilege. The following are the main points we hope to accomplish. First, raising awareness that there is a racial identity in being white and what this might entail. Second, providing a way for white students to begin discovering their own identities being white. And third, raising awareness of the simple privileges that come with being white, such as the avoidance of microaggressions, among other things. Now, in the novel Reconciling All Things, a Christian Vision for Justice, Peace, and Healing, the authors write, "The first language of the church in a deeply broken world is not strategy, but prayer. The journey of reconciliation is grounded in a call to see and encounter the rupture of this world so truthfully that we are literally slowed down. We are called to a space where any explanation or action is too easy, too fast, too shallow, a space where the right response can only be a desperate cry directed to God." So let us learn to do the difficult kingdom work of hoping. For the sake of hospitality and ease, we ask that you move towards the middle of the room in your rows to leave room for those who will join us later. And I hope you enjoy your time with us this evening and on to Sarai. Oh, and let's pray first. Father, thank you so much for this day. Thank you for all who gathered here. Thank you for those who could not be here, fortunately but wanted to be here. Lord, bless this event, bless our speakers. May you minister to each and every one of us in our brokenness, and may our white student body come to terms and reconcile with your white identity, hopefully a little more through this event. Cover it in all your precious blood and ask for grace when mistakes are made. In your precious name, amen. Thank you all.
We would also really like to encourage those of you who it applies to really think about the question, what does being white mean to you, and think about how this plays a role in your racial identity. So now I would like to introduce our first speaker, our very own Rachel Snavely, who is currently serving as Solidarity Cabinet's advisor, one of Solidarity Cabinet's advisors for this year. So would you please help me in welcoming? Whiteness today. As you all came in, you should have been handed a piece of paper. Did everyone get that coming in? If you didn't, shoot your hand up. Right over here. So that you can come around. So what we're going to do is a social identity exercise. And the purpose of this is just to think about the multiple social group memberships that we have. Today we're specifically talking about white racial identity development, but our identities are very complex. You've probably heard the word intersectionality, and that means that our experiences and our identities are kind of multi-layered. And we experience, even though you may experience white privilege, there might be other categories in which you're in a targeted group. So that's what we're going to reflect on. So what you have in front of you, it's kind of like a pie chart, and it's for you to just think about, okay, what are those social group memberships that I have thought about, that I'm aware of? Which ones feel the most salient to me? And just make the ones that feel the most salient the largest piece of the pie. Up here, there are several categories that may relate to your social identity. Some of these may not be a piece of your pie. You've never thought about them. That's fine. It's not a perfect exercise. It's just an opportunity to reflect. So go ahead and I'll give you a minute to do that, and then we'll talk about it. Okay, so hopefully everybody got a chance at least to get started on that. Show of hands if you're comfortable sharing. How many people in one of your two largest slices of your pie are in part of a targeted or marginalized group? Show of hands. Okay. So for me, show an example, mine. And this has changed over time, but for me, I've spent a lot of time thinking about what it means to be a woman. And the reason I think that is because we spend more time and feel as if those parts of our identity that are the most important is what society reflects to us as the most important. So when I was a kid, I noticed right away things about my gender that kind of confused me. So for an example, teachers in class would ask, okay, I need, a group of strong boys to pass out the textbooks. And at that point, I was the strongest person in class. I was an athlete. And so that really kind of got me going. And I would just march up to the front room and pass out those textbooks. But little things like that started to communicate a message to me. That there was something about my gender that didn't match up with my kind of self-concept that society was reflecting back to me. So this is something that's important about you. And not only is it something that's different about you, it's something that makes you less than. So that's something I thought a lot about growing up. Some of these other categories have kind of grown since college, since I've become. I really didn't have to think about what it meant to be white until I was in college. And starting some classes in gender studies actually exposed me to other forms of oppression. And so things like being able-bodied, being white, a lot of those things I never thought about how that would privilege me. So you can see there's, some things being a young adult. Sometimes it's advantaging. Sometimes that's targeted. So each of those group memberships work in a complex way to afford us either privilege and power, or work in ways that are oppressive. Okay, so we're going to define some terms because we want to make sure we're all on the same page in terms of what we're talking about here with language. So a lot of times I hear prejudice or bigotry used interchangeably with racism. So I want to make a distinction between those. Prejudice is a preconceived judgment or opinion, usually based on limited information, what are the inescapable consequences of living in a racist society. So prejudice, when combined with power, is part of a racist system, but not necessarily what we mean when we say racism. When we talk about racism, we're talking about a system of advantage and disadvantage based on race. Internalized oppression is when a member of a stereotype group internalizes the stereotypical categories about his or her own group. So if I internalize the message that I was not strong because I was a girl, that would be internalized oppression. I won't read all of these, but white privilege is that when we're talking about that system of advantage and disadvantage, that's the advantage that we're talking about when it comes to race. And then racial identity development for everyone is the process of defining for yourself the personal significance and social meaning of belonging to a particular racial group. Racial identity and ethnic identity are kind of related in a complex way, but there can be a distinction made between those things. And today we're specifically talking about racial identity development, which may be related to ethnic identity development. But ethnic identity is a socially defined group based on cultural things, and race is socially constructed based on physical criteria. Okay. If I'm over here, is that going to be okay? Where's Brandon? Am I out of
I'm
view?
not sure. I haven't seen the camera.
Okay.
Sam, can you take a look? Is she in the shot?
So,
No.
No one is white
No.
before. Okay.
Yeah,
That's okay.
that's good.
I'm just gonna look over. So James Baldwin said, "No one is white before he or she comes to America," and what that is getting at is this social construction that we're talking about when it comes to race. And so, let's say a woman from Kenya comes here. She may not have thought of herself as black before she came here. She wasn't coming from a racialized society. But then when she comes here, all of a sudden there's kind of this socially constructed category that she falls into. And so if you're coming from another context, that's what we're kind of talking about when we talk about a socially constructed meaning, is that. So one of the ways this has happened in a ton of ways in our country. One of the things that historians point to is in the 17th century, Bacon's Rebellion. So a little history lesson here. So the first Africans that actually were brought here were captured by a Dutch ship from a Spanish ship. And the Spanish had a practice of baptizing people when they captured them. Well, the English had a law that baptized Christians could not be enslaved. So the first Africans that actually came here were more like indentured servants. So you have slavery kind of evolving over the 17th century. And so you have Africans who are enslaved, who are indentured servants, and who are free. And there's some shared interest between European indentured servants and Africans. So there's this rebellion because there's that shared interest against the governor, William Berkeley. And historians believe this rebellion kind of hastened the Virginia Slave Code and created this kind of racial caste and racial language. It kind of firmed it up because the ruling class did not want to see those shared interests unite a class of people. And so you have the Virginia slave codes that kind of stripped rights from some people in order to create that division. So that's one of the ways that you kind of see that social construction working out. So this is in the book American Slavery, American Freedom. is that there was a lesson for the ruling class in this rebellion, and so there was a strategy to divide people. Whiteness in our country has actually evolved in meaning. So at the beginning of the 20th century, there were kind of 4 Euro races. And some people, the Nordic race was kind of the superior race at the beginning of the 20th century. And there were all these kind of scientists trying to show biologically how these races were different, which is not accepted anymore. But post-World War II, anti-Semitism and these other kind of anti-European racism is going out of fashion. And so with the 1944 Servicemen's Readjustment Act, that is also referred to the GI Bill of Rights, you have some people who were not really included in whiteness before being included. So a lot of times you'll hear, so this is coming from an article called Have Jews Became White Folks? And what that says about race in America. A lot of times when you'll hear about like the success of certain groups, it's contributed or attributed to cultural factors, right? Does that sound like something you've heard before? That people as hardworking or really ambitious. This Jewish scholar said, like, wait a second, after the war, there was all this wealth, and some people got access to it, and some people didn't. So for the first time, they're kind of getting included in this whiteness category, and they're experiencing preferential hiring, financial support, access to education, all this access to affordable housing. And so obviously, ethnic discrimination, this is like very complicated, right? You have some groups that still are experiencing some discrimination, but who have also experienced some systemic advantage because of being included in this version of whiteness. So it gets very complex. Women, however, for this GI Bill of Rights, were auxiliary services. So a lot of women, in the capacities that they were allowed to serve, they didn't qualify for these services. You also couldn't access these things if you were dishonorably discharged. Well, at this point in time, you have mostly white officers, and you have black GIs dishonorably discharged at a rate about twice as much as white GIs. So there's a disproportionate effect. And you also have redlining going. Who's heard of redlining? Okay. So the FHA kind of color-coded communities. So there's these new low-interest loans and this boon in affordable housing for all of these GIs coming back from the war. But communities were rated on a color scale, and access to these loans was not given if a community was redlined. And so that's another way that racial discrimination kind of played out in the distribution of all this wealth after the war. Okay, so in a little bit we're going to watch a video from Allison Ash talking about her own story of racial identity development, and she's going to reference a model called the Helms. It's developed by a woman named Janet Helms. So we're going to go through each stage and talk about what that looks like. I think I have the book. I'll show it to you all later. Beverly Daniel Tatum wrote a book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? If you're interested in racial identity development, it's a great place to start. And she talks about prejudice as like smog in the air. And I really think that's a good metaphor because we're just kind of breathing it in. We're breathing in all of these messages. We didn't put that smog there, but it's there. We're experiencing it. And we have a responsibility to kind of address what's going on. This is from a study done 5-10 years back. And they asked students to point to, who is the good child? Who is the pretty child? Who do you think, your teacher likes? And this showed racial bias, at a very young age. Another article I read showed even as young as 6 months, people are already showing signs of racial bias and across races. And that has psychological implications. And so the reason I talk about that study is when we're talking about racial identity development, it's slightly different for people of color and for for white folks because, I'll just read this. In a race-conscious society, racial group membership has psychological implications. The messages we receive about assumed superiority or inferiority shape our perceptions of reality and influence our interactions with others. While the task for people of color is to resist negative societal messages and develop an empowered sense of self, the task for whites is to develop a positive white identity based in reality, not on assumed superiority. In order to do that, each person must become aware of his or her whiteness and accept it as personally and socially significant. So Janet Helm's model she calls them statuses, one of the things I like about this model is it doesn't talk about stages in kind of a linear fashion. She talks about statuses, and so it's fluid. So if you get to kind of the sixth status, you have not arrived, you still have to learn some more, and you can revert and kind of relapse or be triggered in certain situations to some of the other stages. There are 2 developmental tasks. In the first 3 statuses, the goal is the abandonment of individual racism. In the second developmental task, thanks, Brent. Thank you. The second group of 3 statuses, the goal is the recognition of and opposition to institutional and cultural racism. So the first stage, the contact stage, this is a stage where you're totally unaware of your racial identity, racial bias, and this is white racial identity. We're talking about white racial identity development. You may accept kind of outright racism or more subtle versions of racism, like the colorblind perspective. And you may think of racism in that kind of limited definition that we talked about at the beginning as just like acts of bigotry on a kind of an individual level rather than as a system. You might see people on the stage who are actively embracing white superiority or just passively kind of absorbing that message. And it sounds like I'm just normal. I don't really have a white racial identity. In the disintegration phase, this is where you've encountered something that has made you kind of realize your racial identity and privilege. So you've had a personal encounter, or maybe you're for me, I'm sitting in class learning about this stuff. Maybe that's some of your experience as well. Or maybe you've been exposed to, you're in a grocery store and you witness discrimination. And this, it makes you very uncomfortable. There's a new term that I think is kind of helpful. It's called white fragility. And if you've not had to deal with racial tension or the reality of racial discrimination, then when you learn about it for the first time, it's very painful. And so you might feel feelings of guilt, feelings of shame, anger, and we'll get to the next stage, what we do with that. But you're starting to become aware, like something's going on here. And that's kind of conflicting with some of the values that you have. Meritocracy's meaning is like people kind of get what they deserve. So that's like a deep kind of myth in our society that if you work hard, you're going to make it. So that conflicts with it. So you might it's painful, right? So you might kind of withdraw from that. But if you remain engaged, you can turn that into action. In the reintegration phase, you're trying to relieve that discomfort. So maybe you were experiencing some guilt or denial, and that can be transformed into fear and anger and directed toward people of color. So, okay, I'm realizing there's something that's going on here with race, and it can turn into some victim blaming. So there must be something going on here that these people are responsible. And there's a lot of pressure to do that, right? Because the status quo is to preserve status quo. I mean, the powers that be, kind of want to preserve the system. And it's for the first time you might be experiencing some group membership that is uncomfortable. Like I'm an individual, right? Why are you talking about me in terms of group categories? In the next stage, the pseudo-independent stage, you're kind of getting an intellectual awareness of racism as a system of advantage, but you don't really know what to do with it yet. And you might feel self-conscious and guilty about that advantage. And the immersion and emergent stage, this is when it kind of takes a positive turn. You're trying to understand what it means to be white and search for positive role models. So instead of feeling really guilty, you're searching out, okay, who are some anti-racist white folks that I can look to as role models. So you're starting to develop a positive racial identity development, not based in superiority, but in the fact that you can resist the system. So the guilt and the shame. Now, for me, the guilt and the shame, they come up. So that can happen. But at this stage, that can start to fade. And you can start to build, this is when people start to kind of look to other white folks who are doing anti-racist work and kind of build coalitions and support one another. In the final status, and remember these are fluid, you're continually open to new information. So that, again, like feeling that you've arrived, not really the case. You're continually learning and seeking new information, new ways of thinking about race and culture, and develop strong and mutually respectful relationships with people of color to resist these structures. Again, even when this kind of anti-racist thinking is dominant, there might still be particular things that trigger, kind of the old ways of responding. That happens to anger comes up for me. There are certain things that kind of trigger that. Okay. Resources. If you know anyone on Solidarity Cabinet, they will tell you I love to throw books and articles at them. So here are some books that I would suggest. And there's a lot. I try to get a diverse representation of authors and topics. But if there are certain things that you're interested in, please email me. If there's something that you're like, I just didn't understand that, or something you said really bothered me and you want to get coffee, I'll have my email up here in a second. Email me. Let's sit down and let's talk. Where a lot of the content for this presentation came from, especially on the racial identity development model, is Why All the Black Kids Sing Together in the Cafeteria by Beverly Daniel Tatum, who's a social psychologist, so that's a psychological model. And then there's some Christian books up here. This is one of my absolute favorite books, and it mentions Chicago a lot. The Warmth of Other Suns. It's really, really good. But if you're interested in something, you want recommendations, let me know. That's my email address.
Okay, thank you, Rachel, for that. Now we're going to watch another video, as Rachel had mentioned earlier, created by Allison Ash, the Dean of Student Care here at Wheaton. She has a master's in divinity from Fuller Theological Seminary and is currently working on a PhD in higher education. Unfortunately, she was not able to be here tonight, but she has allowed us to share with you this video in which she is describing her journey in discovering her racial identity.
I remember taking my first trip to the Grand Canyon. From a distance, I didn't see much that looked all that special. I could only see the surface of the vast desert ground. But as I got to the edge and looked down into the canyon, I saw the majestic, intricate, different colored, intimately fashioned layers and crevices of rock that went on and on as far as I could see. Walking to the edge and looking into the canyon itself gave me an accurate picture beyond the surface. Maybe this is how it is with us as humans. We often look at people and see only the surface, forgetting that each person is a beautiful, unique, and complex creation with layers of identity that are weaved together to create one special, sacred person. Kimberly Williams Crenshaw captures this idea of the complexity of one's identity through her theory of intersectionality. The idea that one's identity can only be understood when looking at the intersection of multiple identities, such as race and gender. Essentialism, the opposite of intersectionality, is the belief that people who are assigned to a particular group, male or African American, white, all share common thoughts and behaviors and beliefs. But essentialism has the potential for people to be stereotyped and for the complex identities to be misunderstood. This is why storytelling is so important. When essentialism says, you are who I say you are because you're just like everyone else in your group, a person's story becomes the counter-narrative to essentialism. Counter-narrative is a core component of critical race theory, which is the study of race, power, and privilege in society. Although counter-narrative often does involve people's personal stories, the purpose of counter-narrative, as it relates to critical race theory, is not simply to hear an interesting life story. The purpose is to expose the listener to the reality of social injustice, privilege, and oppression, which is often counter to the broader narrative of society. I'm going to tell you part of my story and how I came to understand that I am white. When my mother had to register my brother, sister, and me into a racial category for the US Census form, she would check other and write in Heinz 57. I didn't understand why she did this until I began to see and understand the racial diversity of my family. As a child, when I would visit my father's side of the family, I remember sitting in the laps of aunts and uncles and my grandfather who had brown and caramel skin, unlike my white skin, like my mom's side of the family, that looked just like me. It wasn't until my sister asked one time, "Dad, is Aunt Nett black?" that I realized that my skin color and Aunt Nett's skin color were in fact very different. I don't remember my father ever answering my sister's question. We didn't talk about the fact that his grandmother was black and that many of my aunts and uncles and cousins are black. It wasn't until a few years later at family weddings and funerals that I met many of my relatives who had darker skin than Aunt Nett's. And it was then when I saw their dark skin and coarse hair and my light skin and straight blonde hair that I realized we were not the same. They were black and I was white. At that time, I didn't know anything about this part of my family. My immediate family never spoke about it. It wasn't until years later that my father told me that growing up in his community, his family was black. From the time I was a small child sitting on Aunt Nett's lap, meeting my black aunts and uncles and cousins, I began unconsciously searching for my own racial identity. Although I grew up in a small, rural, white farming community in West Michigan, and later attended a predominantly white college, I found myself grasping onto any small glimmer of a chance to understand difference and diversity throughout high school and college. As a 10-year-old, I decided that my only African American friend at my summer camp was my boyfriend. In college, I was drawn to friendships with the few African American students that I had. And I always seemed to experience more intense anger and outrage than my fellow white classmates when I learned about injustices like slavery and segregation. While I was in seminary, I took ethics, systematic theology, and New Testament classes related to race and injustice, and my search for my racial identity converged with a theological understanding of the mandate for justice. In these classes, I learned about things like the construction of whiteness through U.S. immigration policy, which forced citizens to biologically prove their whiteness in order to become citizens, about legal forms of discrimination that prohibited black qualified Americans the right to home ownership in desirable areas, and about black liberation theology from reading authors like James Cone. This convergence of personal searching and racial and theological awareness raised enough courage and curiosity in me to begin asking my mother and father and aunt and my grandfather the difficult questions about my family's race that we had never talked about. This is when the stories started to emerge of my mother receiving an anonymous harassing phone call shortly after becoming engaged to my father, where the angry caller said, "Are you really going to marry that N-word, Jan Goins?" And my aunt's white classmate questioning her about riding on a float in their hometown parade, saying, "Why did they let that N-word ride the Blossom Time float?" My father's parents and grandparents' unwillingness to discuss their racial heritage and identity. My grandfather's denial of his own race, and my great-grandfather being arrested, for doing nothing more than riding on the train. And my great-grandfather's registered race on his birth certificate that was white, but on his marriage certificate was colored. And my father and his family's black categorization in his rural hometown community, but my father passing as white later in life. The combination of the awareness of white construction and systematic racism and injustice, along with my family's stories about experiences of systemic racism and injustice, made me extremely confused about my own sense of identity. This confusion sent me straight into the stage of white identity development that Janet Helms calls disintegration, the process of losing any sense of a positive view of being part of my racial group. I didn't want to be associated with being white because I didn't want to be the bad guy. I wanted to stand alongside my family and be angry with and for them at the challenges of their past. I didn't want to be associated with the group that was racist against them. But I began to learn that being white or black or any other race was not a categorization that I could choose, any more than my father and his family could choose whether he was black in his hometown or white later in life, or whether my great-grandfather, who was white at birth and then somehow mysteriously became categorized as colored by the time he was married. Though I did not have a label for it at the time, I was beginning to learn about another core tenet of critical race theory, social construction, which is the idea that societies, not individuals, construct race. And as much as I may have wanted to strip myself of my whiteness in order to stand in solidarity with my family members, I began to understand that because I was categorized as white, I was part of a system that made me the recipient of a host of privileges, whether I had asked for them or not. Peggy McIntosh explains white privilege as an invisible package of unearned assets, which I can count on cashing in each day, but about which I was meant to remain oblivious. An example of me being oblivious to my white privilege was when I was the director of chapel at Fuller Seminary. Given my current journey of personal racial understanding, I was particularly committed to leading chapel services that represented the diversity of our campus. At one particular chapel, we projected images of Jesus throughout the sermon, images requested and chosen by the speaker. Personally, I was moved by the images and message and felt good about the entire chapel. That week, an African-American student and a friend of mine asked to have coffee, and she brought up the chapel service. I was surprised when she told me that she was extremely disappointed in the chapel. She said, "Allison, every image of Jesus was of a white man. Couldn't there have been some different images to reflect the diversity of those attending the chapel that day?" I was tempted to defend myself, to explain that someone else had chosen the images and that I hadn't reviewed them beforehand, which actually was true. But honestly, I knew I wouldn't have changed anything because her suggestion didn't cross my mind when I was looking at the images during that chapel. This experience taught me 3 critical lessons. First, it revealed to me my privilege of being able to view my race as the norm through the religious symbols and reflections that represented me. Scholars call this white normativity, the idea that white people understand life in society and that is accepted as the norm or just the way things are. Second, and more frightening, the experience made me aware that my privilege was invisible to me. As much as I had wanted to associate with my father and other relatives, and as much as I was committed to creating chapel services that were inclusive of all people, I could not escape the fact that I had been molded by society's categorization of me that told me that I was the norm. I learned that good intentions were not enough. And lastly, I learned that standing in solidarity with my family did not mean denying my whiteness, but doing the tough work of self-examination to embrace my identity, to become aware of my privilege, and to begin seeing the ways in which I had unknowingly been complicit in the very kinds of things that grieved me about the experiences of my family. One part of my privilege is the ability to choose when and how I outwardly care about issues of justice. In other words, I can choose when I hold on to privilege and when I let it go. If I'm totally honest, the price and risk of losing my positive image among other white people at times feels like too great of a cost. But if I claim to be a Christian, a person who chooses to follow the example of Jesus, protecting my privilege for personal benefit is not an option. In Philippians, a New Testament book of the Bible, the Apostle Paul lists many of his ethnic and racial privileges. being a Jew from the tribe of Benjamin, having been circumcised, having been a Pharisee and seen as blameless under the law. But then after that list in Philippians 3:7, he says this, "Yet whatever gains I had, these I have come to regard as loss for the sake of Christ." If a family member disapproves of me participating in social justice, or if a friend questions my choice to study and write about race and diversity, what image, reputation, social capital am I going to lose? And am I willing to lose it? I've come to understand that just as I had to walk to the edge of the Grand Canyon and look into it to see beyond its surface, the same is true for understanding those who are different than I am. Knowing a person's story helps me see beyond the surface of their identity and understand the intricate intersectionality of identities that converge to make him or her a unique creation. But perhaps more important is walking to the edge of myself, and peering over the side and looking beyond the surface into the depths of me.
But I wanted to go for a walk. So I put on my blue Farm and Fleet rubber boots. I put them on and I can walk anywhere I want. And I literally walk down my driveway and I'm squishing in the mud a couple inches deep, and then I walk through puddles that are 5 inches deep. And I have this awesome walk. And I was thinking as I was walking that these rubber boots, not these, they're blue. I mean, these are leather, these would get messed up. But my rubber boots, I thought, are actually a lot like white privilege. My rubber boots allow me to go wherever I want and not have to go out of my way. And they allow me to not have to get mud at me. And let me explain how that relates to white privilege. So this idea of white normativity is a fancy word for what I mean by not having to go out of my way. I was thinking the other day, when I talk about theology, when I use the word theology, I don't have to use a qualifying word to talk about the theology of the people who look like my ancestors. I don't have to add black, I don't have to add African, Latin American, Asian, liberation. It's just theology. The same goes for literature, dance, music theory, world history that I learned in elementary school. There's a lot I don't have to do. I don't have to explain to my children why Band-Aids match their skin, but not the skin of all their friends. I don't have to tell my students why every single teacher that they've ever had in their elementary and middle school has had the same skin color as them, but not all their students in their classes. Talking about race, a student told me recently, is still optional in many settings, including the student was saying here at Wheaton. I talk about it with my kids, but it's not optional, but it is optional. It occurred to me the other day when my son was watching Green Bay Packer game with me, sort of from Wisconsin, and he said to me, he's 11, he said, why does it seem like the only players you ever notice are Clay Matthews and Aaron Rodgers and Jordy Nelson? And I said, honey, those are 3 white players. And I have the option of talking to my kids about what is implicit bias and the fact that they might see the white players. I mean, they're good players, but still, they see those players in a different way than they see other people. But these conversations, I could easily just glide by. I went to the Women's March in Boston last weekend with a group of some of my best friends from my undergraduate years. And before we went, we were sharing some things we were reading about this. And one of my friends shared a post that was challenging to me. It's by a woman named Shishi Rose. I apologize, I don't know how to pronounce her first name, but I'm going to say Shishi. And she writes this. She's black. She says, for some people, their outlook of this country deeply changed on November 9th. For the rest of us, this is how it has always looked. I want to remind you that that is a privilege. It's a privilege that white supremacy wasn't at the forefront of your reality because you benefit from it. I want to remind you that no ally ever got very far in any movement without acknowledgement of their own privilege daily. You do not just get to join the efforts that people of color have been working for their entire lives to both teach and survive without doing the work too. You don't just get to join because now you're scared too. I was born scared. I can write an article about race. I can stand in a demonstration related to race. And I have the privilege of having people not assume that, well, of course you're in that demonstration. Of course you're talking about race, because that's what minorities always talk about. That's a privilege. And the other thing about boots that I said is I don't have to get mud on me. What I mean by that is I can walk around in the mud and I come home and I'm still clean. I take off my boots and people will see the best of me. Having privilege means people expect the best of me. An example, my daughter lost a library book recently. I had to walk into the library and explain, sorry, we lost a library book. And the librarian was so nice, she was white. And I walked out and I thought, man, she just expected so much of me. Like, she just thought I'm such a good person, and she didn't even ask why we lost this library book. And it was really nice, and I thought, if I were not white, would she look at me and think, of course he lost the library book, everyone else people loses library books. I know those thoughts might have occurred to me at certain stages in my life. My friend Jocelyn, who also joined me on the march last weekend, is Latina, and she was born in the Dominican Republic. Her husband is a Cuban refugee, and is very dark skinned. She's kind of mean and dark, but their kids are really dark. And she went into a swimming pool in my, not far from my neighborhood. And she was just going in to get her son, and she was there with her daughter. And she walked up and she said, we just need to go in for like a couple minutes to tell my son that it's time to come out. And the woman at the entrance gave her this big hassle and was like, no, you have to pay, and everybody has to pay, and who are you to think that you can just walk in? You have to pay here. And she was like, I'm just going in for like 1 minute. And there's sort of this big, like, long discussion about this. Finally, she's like, I'm just going in. And she just walked past and went and got her son. And while she was there, she explained to her friend who was there, who was white, what had just happened. And this white friend said, I just got in for free, like an hour ago. And I said I was just here to get my kids and stay here for an hour. So they walk out together and talk to the people at the front. And it was the same woman working there who had let the white woman go through and not let my friend, who is Latina, through. That's white privilege. And the list could go on and on. But I think it's worth talking about what to do about that. And Rachel did the heavy lifting of giving us all kinds of words for this, and that's awesome, because I can sort of just give you stories now. So Shishi Rose goes on in this post that was hard-hitting for me to say, now is the time for you to be listening more, talking less, spend time observing, taking in media and art created by people of color, researching, and unlearning the things that you have been taught about this country. You should be reading our books and understanding the roots of racism and white supremacy, listening to our speeches. You should be drowning yourselves in our poetry. Now is the time that you should be exposed to more than just the horrors of this country, but also the beauty that has always existed within communities of color. Beauty that was covered over because the need to see white faces depicted was more important. Now is the time to teach your children, to call out your family, to finally speak up. You have been silent for long enough. Now is the time to realize that you should have joined us sooner. But since you're here now, it's time to get to work. And I love that description of the first thing that I would say we need to realize as white people, which is give yourself permission to be a learner among learners. I really like the picture of stages, or actually statuses. I like that word even better too. In this journey, because we're all in a journey. It doesn't matter what your racial identity is, we're all in a journey. And some of us have good moments and bad moments, and we have those together. And we have to acknowledge that we're all learners in this together. And that means you're going to make mistakes. I'm going to tell you a story that I feel like you're going to think I should get fired at Wheaton for. This is one of those stories that makes me want to just like crawl under a table. It happened 20 years ago, and I still think back to it, and I'm like, I was so dumb. And this is the story. I was with my friend Jocelyn, and she went to a Spanish-speaking church, congregation of a Methodist church, and I would often play piano at their church. And she asked me to come with her to the high school youth group one time. And I showed up at this youth group, and I was like trying to like break the ice and like fit in. And so she asked me to introduce myself, and I don't remember the exact words, but I basically said, I don't speak Spanish very well, but I can talk like you too. And I said that in like this mock Spanish accent. And I look back at it and I'm like, what on earth was I doing? And it was like this silence where these students just like looked at me like, what are you doing? Do you think that mocking our accent is gonna somehow like make us relate? But I didn't know. I was raised in Whitewater, Wisconsin, and as I was telling people earlier, Whitewater was white. All my teachers were white. Like 99% of my friends were white, and I just didn't know. So we're learners. We do stupid things. And the other part of this too is that people will hurt you fast. And that's hard too. There's the forgiving yourself, but there's also forgiving other people. My friend Leah, who also is really good friends with Jocelyn and with myself, we were hanging out. We went to the Women's March together this last weekend. And she lives in Philadelphia, and her son goes to a school where he is the only white kid in his class. She is a professor of community development, and she's taken off time. She only teaches one class a semester so that she can volunteer in her son's school a lot of hours every week. And she's been shouted at, and she has a certain woman on the school board who just hates her and complains about her and doesn't want her there and thinks that she is a white woman who's coming to just take over the school. And my friend Leah has wrestled with this
back? Does she get involved? Does she just give up and move away and do something else? But she's talking about, like, it's a journey. This woman is at a stage also. We're all dealing with our racial identity, and we're all dealing with the pain and hurt that goes with dealing with this together. So we need to forgive each other and forgive ourselves. And along with that, I tell you this story that makes me want to crawl under a table because of this second point, which is your self-loathing helps no one. One of the stages of white racial identity is often self-loathing, white guilt, white fragility. Talking about this with my friend Leah, she said, I remember a time after college, she lived in Latin America, she lived in Philadelphia, and she said, there was a time when I couldn't bleed enough. I hated myself, I hated who I was. And she talked about a conversation with Jocelyn in which Leah, who's white, said, I don't want to be white. I want to be Latina. I want to be anything else except white. And Jocelyn, my dear friend, said back to her, I don't want you to be Latina. I love that you are white. I need you to be white. God made you white. And those words have transformed Leah's life. Like, she's still, she still wrestles with it. She's still in there trying to figure out who am I and what the heck am I doing in this world. But she is white, and she is dealing with that, and she's at a more mature stage because of that. The final thing I want to say leads into tomorrow, and this is a phrase out of the book that Rachel also mentioned. We didn't plan this beforehand, but the warmth of other suns. This is actually from a conversation with the author, Isabel Wilkerson. I was going to recommend the same book, but I was telling some students beforehand, I feel kind of bad about recommending it because I think it's like 400 pages long. But it's going to be a really good 400 pages if you want to read it. So Isabel Wilkerson did this interview with Krista Tippett, and in it, she talks about responses after the Ferguson incident and black men being shot and it being talked about. And she said there's so many issues involved in this. But one thing that she noticed was the lack of just human response. This is a quote from her interview. She says, why was there not even the basic human response to take someone's hand of someone whose life is slipping away from them and to comfort them? That is the essential missing piece, which is empathy. Empathy and recognition of the common humanity of another person. And she uses this phrase, radical empathy. So I want you to give yourself permission to be a learner among learners. I want you to recognize that your self-loathing helps no one, and then to practice radical empathy. And this is the definition that she gave of it in this interview. She says, empathy is not pity or sympathy, in which you are looking down on someone and feeling sorry for them. Sympathy, you may be looking across at someone and feeling bad for them. Empathy means inside of them and understanding their reality. Looking at the situation and saying, not, what would I do if I were in that position, but what are they doing? Why are they doing what they're doing? From the perspective of what they have endured. I wish I had a really positive example to end on, but I'm going to end that kind of a downer example of what radical empathy is not. I do research in South Africa, and it's on unemployment. And what I do is hang out with a lot of unemployed people who are black in South Africa. And I also have conversations with employers and all kinds of people about what unemployment means. And we talk about meritocracy a lot. This assumption that the people who are unemployed because they're lazy, and laziness is something that is inherent in blackness and also in maleness and youth, and it sort of is essentialized into the population there. So I had this conversation with a woman who was white, and she's so beautiful, and she's so like loving and adoring and kind to me and welcoming me into her house and giving me coffee, and she goes to my church, and I'm talking about unemployment with her, and she's like, well, you know, the thing about unemployment is if you or I were unemployed, we would do something about it. We'd get off our butts and go find a job. That is not radical empathy. Let me reemphasize. It is not saying, what would I do if I was in their situation? Because I am white. what I would do is what I've always done, which is live a life of a white person. Radical empathy is saying, what would I do if I were in their position? Or sorry, not what would I do if I were in their position, but what are they doing? Why are they doing what they're doing from the perspective of what they have endured? And I think that hopefully is what you're going to deal with tomorrow also, is what it means to be a white ally as well. So, coming close to the finishing of our event. However, we do want to open up this time now for a brief Q&A for anyone who has questions that they'd like to ask our speakers, Rachel and Dr. Josie. So, yes, I will have them come up.
Hi, I'm Miriam. I work for Soldarity. I just have a question. It's about what's happening right now in the U.S. in general with President Trump and the way he has been dealing with these issues. And personally, and I'm not talking for everyone, I've been feeling really hopeless, and I don't even know where to start. Or sometimes I even felt like the conversation is not worth anymore. Because no matter how persistent you are, you're just being shut down. I feel like within a few days, a lot of freedoms have been taken away. And I would just really love to hear what your view is and where starting point would be. Because it kind of feels like we have regressed so much. How do we catch up? And how do we just go ahead as we were, trying to do previously? With things of racial reconciliation, women's rights and so on.
One thing that I think about it is, I think back to, I was in South Africa when Ferguson was in the news, and there was this sort of like boom of talk about race in the United States. And I heard about it from a distance, and my South African friends were like, oh, I was telling something that South African friends were saying, is U.S. something like really racist or something? I was like, no, it's always been there, but it's talked about. It's out on the surface. And I think as much as I hate what's happening, I mourn over it, it breaks my heart. I do take hope in the fact that it's out on the surface in another way. I think back to my parents who were at the University of Wisconsin in the 1960s in these years of protest, and they tell stories tear gas and protesting and like everybody sort of like in uproar in the United States, or at least on a liberal campus like Madison. And I think we're moving into a different time, and I think there's something we need to do of just like being aware of the times that we live in a biblical sense, like and recognizing we don't need to be scared of the times. We need to acknowledge what they are and live into them, into what God is calling us to be in at this time.
Yeah, I think learning about Bacon's Rebellion has kind of affected how I view this election in terms of some of the racially coded language. I think one of the best things for relieving anxiety is action. And so, and I'm encouraged that I'm really drawing strength from generations that have gone before us and the work that they've done. A couple weeks ago, I'm in a field placement and we have supervision every week, and my supervisor was just talking about the work that her generation did to kind of begin to dismantle some of these structures. And she was very emotional about kind of the moment of time that we're in. And I just told her, you know what, I work with college students, and I'm kind of drawing strength from the generations that have gone before, and also drawing strength from you all, because I see in this generation some coalition building that I think has been present in the civil rights movement, for example. But I mean, you see Black Lives Matter activists at the Dakota Access Pipeline project. I mean, there's some coalition building that's happening. That I work with college students, and I see in this generation some coalition building that I think has been present in the civil rights movement, for example. But you see Black Lives Matter activists at the Dakota Access Pipeline project. I mean, there's some coalition building that's happening. I that is really encouraging. And so I just see a lot of potential for positive change, even though the kind of the moment that we're in right now is very painful. So that's where I've been drawing strength from.
I love the line of the chapel speaker, Lauren, what's her last name? Thank you. Yeah. It said last Wednesday, she said remember there are those who came before, those who came before, and those who came before. I just wanted to, as she was saying that, because we need to remember that.
I just had a question about that last example that you gave. What was a way that the woman you were talking to, where you could have done a better job, like something she could have said or done to like empathize with those two?
Yeah,
go ahead. Yeah.
So I'm studying social work right now, and I'm doing a placement at the People's Resource Center. And so I work with people who are looking for jobs. And some of the barriers that people have to getting a job, I mean, you know, their car is broken down, they don't have money for gas, they can't get to interviews, maybe they, you know, don't have access to the internet all the time. And so when you hear the word, I mean, and they're showing up for job orientations and, you know, all these things. So there are barriers that, you know, I remember this, like, image of, in the news, it's probably like a year ago, and, you know, someone's standing, you know, begging on a corner, and there's another person next to them, like, get a job, or Walmart hiring or something. And it's like, if you knew the barriers, and once you get a job at Walmart, they're paying you can't live on what you're getting paid. And so it's really, really difficult. So I think that's part of, first of all, just understanding the barriers, and you know why it's happening, why the unemployment is occurring in disproportionate ways, and looking at it that way.
That's good. I need another question. Sure. That's great.
You guys talked a lot about how our responses might be self-loathing or maybe denial. But what about the response of perhaps being bitter towards other white people that don't necessarily want to explore the idea of listening to injustice?
I mean, I think that actually, again, this awareness of these statuses is really helpful. I've seen this happen in classrooms where students overhear other students make comments that are not at the status that they're at, or not at the stage that they're at, and are disgusted by it. And actually, sometimes white students are more vocal than anybody else because they're just appalled. And I think like a part of it is this like, I will never go back there again, and I don't know what to do, but I need to do something. So I don't know how to say it other than I guess like recognize that people like. I think of my classes as everybody needs to just take some steps forward wherever you're at. And some people are here and some people are here, but we're all taking a step forward. So, you know, meeting people where they're at, I think, is a big part of it. Recognizing that if you didn't have, I mean, for me, if I didn't have the white privilege that I have, I would be better at dealing with this because I would have experienced a lot more microaggression and like had to deal with the fact that white people are doing wrong things all the time. You know, I would have been unfortunately practiced in dealing with white people doing uncomfortable things. So yeah, like accepting that this is a part of your privilege that you're even that annoyed at it. That makes sense?
Yeah, and I think remembering like when you were in that stage too, I have to remember that I have not always known the things I've known, and remember what that was like, and sometimes give people the benefit of the doubt, but also you're in a situation, there's kind of responsibility. Interactions with my family, it kind of triggers this for me, and I'll get very, very angry. So I think help remembering where I am, but also realizing this is my sphere of influence, and so if they're at at a stage where what they need is, people need different things at different stages. So I think kind of recognizing that and trying to help people move forward, and recognizing like your sphere of influence as well. So taking action and and building support too among other anti-racist folks that are doing, the kind of things that you want to be doing too, and just talking about it.
How would you respond to the accusation, or have you, if it's been made, that encouraging conversations about race is just sort of imposing the concept of political correctness? I mean, how would you respond to someone who sort of is able to write off what you're saying based on that accusation? What would your response be to that?
I think talking in inclusive ways, to me, is very much connected to my faith and Christianity and the Imago Dei, the image of God in people. And so I think a lot of times that'll come up in terms of like language, politically correct language. And I just think of it in a different way. So I guess if someone brought up, you're just trying to be politically. Can you say that again? Your question.
You're listening, yeah.
Okay. I think just framing it as respectful language, respecting other people, and for me that's part of a Christian response. It's not an attempt to be politically correct. It's an attempt to use language that's respectful of a diverse experience.
Yeah, I would say that too. I mean, I think that we all are responsible for using everything we know, as far as we know how to treat people well. So if you know a politically correct way of treating someone, there's a reason that that's considered politically correct. You owe it to that person in a sort of Imago Dei way of using that. I'm not sure if this is what your question is getting at though, but I think that something that I've seen happen is that people get so paralyzed by being politically correct that they actually are not talking productively about it. Actually, I was going to have you all do this. Can everyone just say black, 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 black? Say it with me, black, black, black. Can you all say Asian American, Asian American, Asian American? Can you all say Native American, Native American, Native American? Can you all say American Indian, American Indian? So I do that because I think, I see students do this where they're like, well, I knew this person and they were Asian American. Or they were African American. It's like you're pausing, you're like, what's the right word to say? And we're trying to be so careful and tiptoe around things that we never actually say anything. So, if you don't know the right word to use, ask. Native American, American Indian, for example, both okay. I didn't know that until recently, until someone who was American Indian told me that. And it might differ from person to person, but anyway, so don't be so politically correct that you can't talk and you can't just get into actually doing something. Yeah, we got it for a time.
Yeah, I understand that now it's 8 o'clock and this is when the event is supposed to end. I don't know. Yeah. So. Our speakers for joining us tonight. Also coming out and joining us tonight, and
leave the Soldarity cabinet.
Continue these conversations and encourage you all to come to our event tomorrow, which we'll be discussing what it means to be a white ally. Same time, same place. Bring friends, bring